This unique series will take us through the 4 seasons of the Bankster and help illustrate in the simplest of terms how they rise and fall from power. Every month for the next 4 months, we will release and retire the 4 coins until the story is told. The first installment is the rise of the Bankster, called Competition is a Sin. This coin was inspired from John D. Rockefeller, who ruthlessly consolidated the new oil industry. Rockefeller bought or drove out all competition at every level of his business. At one point, 1% of the entire U.S. economy flowed through his businesses. He grew so large that a famous antitrust case was brought about to break up Standard Oil into 7 companies. While it is commonly thought as a blow to John D. Rockefeller, it was in fact his greatest accomplishment. With one case, the little guy felt like they stuck it to the rich, but the breakup only served to make Rockefeller even wealthier, as the pieces were worth far more than the whole. While John D. Rockefeller saw the breakup of his oil monopoly in 1911, he soon set his eyes on the largest monopoly of all, central banking. The Rothschilds had already owned many of the central banks of Europe, with the Bank of England being their crown jewel. They famously were quoted as saying that they did not care who sat on the throne so long as they issued the money. In 1900, it was estimated that the Rothschilds owned half of the world's wealth. The House of Rothschild expanded their empire secretly through the use of their banks or their agents. Their central banks controlled the currencies throughout most of the Western world. They moved to control the railroads and heavy industry in Europe, controlled the diamond market through Cecil Rhodes, and made huge ventures in the Russian and Arab oil exploration. They even controlled the Vatican finances, believe it or not. They have had great success financing and controlling powerful men to advance their aims. They financed the Harrimans, Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, and Carnegies in the United States. Soon the American industrialists became so wealthy that they did not need debt, and even in the U.S., most of the wealth was moving west away from the Eastern establishment. So while these men were very rich, they were not in complete control. They needed the right crisis to bring about their predetermined plan for another privately owned central bank after Andrew Jackson had killed their last bank. Theodore Roosevelt went about fighting the many monopolies in public for the little guy. But the reality is, he did very little to take away their power. When he quote-unquote broke up Standard Oil, he succeeded in making the Rockefellers even more powerful and rich because the parts were worth more than the whole. After Roosevelt was re-elected, J.P. Morgan and his allies went about calling in loans from smaller banks. This led to a dramatic contraction in the money supply that resulted in people selling their stocks to raise cash. The Panic of 1907 had started. Bank runs began all across the country since most of the banks had very little actual cash reserves due to fractional reserve banking. When the time was right, J.P. Morgan entered the center of the stage and pledged to support the American economy with money created out of thin air. His plan, approved by the Congress, was to create $200 million out of nowhere to support his banks and the markets. Morgan bought up banks and real assets to further consolidate power. The boom-bust cycle was also used to pave the way for a quote-unquote more stable central bank system. By 1908, Morgan had saved the American economy and was declared a hero. This episode is widely seen as the genesis of the new privately owned central bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve. J.P. Morgan caused and then acted as a savior for the rich man's panic of 1907 and acted as a one-man Federal Reserve back then. What was not known was that J.P. Morgan was just a Rothschild frontman and was only worth $80 million upon his death. Even John D. Rockefeller was quoted as saying, "And to think, he wasn't even a rich man." Those not favorable to the money trusts could be squeezed out of business, and the people frightened into demanding changes in the banking and currency laws which the money trust would frame. Congressman Charles Lindbergh. On June 16, 1909, President Taft, in an address to Congress, proposed a 2% federal income tax on corporations by way of an excise tax and a constitutional amendment to allow the previously enacted income tax. This was sold to the public as only a tax on the rich. As we now see, everyone is quote-unquote rich now. The income tax was necessary to fund the government's debt expansion. The interest on the debt had to be guaranteed by the taxes on the people. Twice, the income and corporate tax were found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The 16th Amendment took 4 years for all of the states to ratify. Senator Aldrich pushed the income tax through on February 3, 1913. President Theodore Roosevelt established a National Monetary Commission headed by Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was intimately tied to both J.P. Morgan and the Rockefellers through marriage. Senator Aldrich spent many months touring Europe's or Rothschild's central banks. When he came back, He met some of the most powerful men in America in Jekyll Island to plot the return of the privately held central bank in the United States. Paul Warburg was given $500,000 by Kuhn, Loeb and Company to lobby Congress for a privately owned central bank. His partner, Jacob Schiff, was very close to the Rothschild family and was financially backing the overthrow of the Tsar of Russia. The Schiffs, Warburgs, and Rothschilds were all intermarried and close business partners. The American power and European power conspired to share the new central bank. These elite families saw disturbing trends in securing their empires. Economic and political power was shifting from the East Coast to the West, away from their infrastructure. Competition from smaller local banks and corporations that were able to fund their enterprises from profits as opposed to their debt. They also saw the trend of saving against their industrial and banking interests. Soon, tycoon families would no longer need debt. They also saw that if they could create a private central bank, they could privatize the profits and socialize the losses. In short, these men wanted a monopoly and to crush all competition to their interests. These bankers plotted on Jekyll Island. The name of the bank was most important. It was to be given the illusion that it was a government agency and not a private cartel. They needed to create regional branches to give the appearance that it wouldn't be dominated by Wall Street. They would start slowly once established and move more radically to concentrate power. It was vital to push the idea that a central bank was needed to stabilize the currency and the economy. Finally, they needed to give the appearance that Wall Street did not want this bank. On that trip, the Federal Reserve Act was written by bankers for bankers. Despite the boom-bust cycle, the bankers saw their share of deposits shrink as the amount of banks doubled to over 20,000 banks. The other trend that worked against the big bankers was that businesses started to self-fund projects through profits. Through the Federal Reserve, they could dominate the reserves of the entire country. Special attention was paid to the name of the bank to give it the impression of a government bank and that it had the capacity to be a stabilizing force. They also gave the illusion of the president choosing the chairman and board of governors. The bankers just stacked the deck. This bill would give a monopoly on the creation of U.S. currency to the privately held banker hands. Since I entered politics, I have chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the United States, in the field of commerce and manufacture, are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. Woodrow Wilson. When the bankers floated the Republican Aldrich Plan, it was immediately called out as a Wall Street plan by the opposition. They started to support Woodrow Wilson, the president of Princeton, to run for president of the U.S. But first they would have to indoctrinate him on their policies. The bankers financed Woodrow Wilson as a Democratic presidential candidate. This proved to be the trick they needed to get to their goal. During the election, Democrats condemned the Aldrich Plan and promised no central bank. 13 months later, now President Woodrow Wilson broke his promise and sold this country into slavery. By controlling both sides of the political debate, they ensured victory. The Republican Aldrich Bill became the Democratic Glass-Owen Bill. Brushing aside the external differences affecting the shells, we find the kernels of the two systems very closely resembling and related to one another. Paul Warburg. The bankers even went as far as to have two of the Jekyll Island participants, Aldrich and Vanderlip, come out and oppose the Glass-Owen Bill. Although the Aldrich Federal Reserve Plan was defeated, its essential points were all contained in the plan that was adopted. Frank Vanderlip. The bill was snuck through Congress 2 days before Christmas in 1913. We have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board. This evil institution has impoverished and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures who control it. Congressman Louis McFadden. This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this bill, the invisible government by the monetary power will be legalized. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetrated by this banking bill. Charles Lindbergh. Banking was conceived in iniquity and was born in sin. The bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create deposits, and with the flick of the pen, they will create enough deposits to buy it back again. However, take it away from them, and all the great fortunes like mine will disappear, and they ought to disappear, for this would be a happier and better world to live in. But If you wish to remain the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them continue to create deposits. Sir Josiah Stamp, the director of the Bank of England and the second richest man in England. The 2014 Silver Shield Competition is a Sin is available at the authorized dealers at silvershieldcollection.com. The foundation of the Federal Reserve was necessary for the Anglo-American power led by the Rothschilds and Rockefellers to not only consolidate power over the growing United States, but also for the eventual domination of the world. Without the power of this privately owned central bank that was slipped through Congress just before Christmas in 1913, so much of the evils we see in the world today simply would not exist. Now we will see the summer of the bankster as they manipulate humanity into global war and slavery. The British Empire had been under the financial control of the Rothschild family. This family gloated that since they controlled the money supply of the empire that the sun never set upon, they did not care who sat upon the throne. Their power and influence enabled the British war machine to engage in psychopathic wars with just about every nation on Earth. The British Empire, under the money power of the Rothschilds, invaded 9 out of 10 countries on Earth, leaving only 22 nations on Earth that never felt the debt and death of the British Empire. The Rothschilds profited tremendously off the defeat of Napoleon and financially backed the British Empire's opium wars against China, the conquering of India, the Crimea War, and many more wars in Africa. And with the establishment of the Federal Reserve Central Bank in the United States at the end of 1913, it only extended their power further around the world. At the beginning of the 20th century, Britain had 3 pillars to their domination. Number 1, they had the most formidable navy. This led to the natural domination of trade because the British Navy protected British trade, and non-British ships had to take out insurance through the biggest insurance companies, which were, of course, British. Number 2, they had unquestioned domination of international banking. Since most of the world's trade was through London, this brought tremendous wealth. With coordinated efforts, they could manipulate markets to favor British trade. Number 3, they had domination of the Earth's major raw materials: cotton, metals, coffee, diamonds, coal, and petroleum. All of this was, of course, under the control of the Rothschilds. The British saw a threat on the horizon with an economic and military rival in Germany. Germany had an impressive industrial development along with a modern navy and merchant fleet. Germany had a national system of technical schools that produced highly skilled workers. Germany's coal and steel production soon became world class. Their financial markets were locked together, and that did not allow for speculation or much foreign investment. By 1906, Germany produced the most powerful battleship on the planet. And then 3 years later, in 1909, Germany outdid herself with the Nassau class. This buildup of navy could be for no other reason than to challenge the British. A more alarming development was a Berlin to Baghdad rail line that would give access over land to the huge petroleum resources in the Middle East, circumventing the powerful British Navy. Both Britain and Germany needed oil to run their fleets. Britain was unable to win a land war in Europe, so it needed to get the isolationist American people into World War I. With the creation of the Federal Reserve, the banksters now had unlimited funds built off of the back of the industrious American population. All they needed was the right crisis to push America into World War and save the bankrupt British Empire. Secret negotiations took place between President Woodrow Wilson and the British, as well as the French, to enrage the American people against Germany. Germany's submarine fleet was cutting off England from the rest of the world, and very early on, the British Empire was broke. Germany warned that the military supplies coming from the United States to England would be destroyed, and that supplying arms to Britain would be considered an act of war. By the time of World War I in 1914, the British Treasury was officially bankrupt. Upon the declaration of war, Britain suspended gold and silver payments and placed all the bullion on deposit with the Rothschild-owned Bank of England. They promptly paid out legal tender and recruited J.P. Morgan in America for more financing. Later, Winston Churchill was named the First Lord of the Admiralty. In October of 1914, he changed the policy that allowed unarmed cruisers the option of letting enemy submarines search the ship and be allowed the opportunity to get to the lifeboats before the ship was torpedoed. Now they were forced to engage with submarines, and this cold-blooded strategy was justified by Churchill. Quote, "The first British countermove, made on my responsibility, was to deter the Germans from surface attack. The submerged U-boat had to rely increasingly on underwater attack, and thus ran the greater risk of mistaking neutral for British ships and the drowning of neutral crews, and thus embroiling Germany with other great powers." Unquote. Problem, reaction, solution. The Lusitania was a military vessel in every way except for that it was converted for civilian use. She had 1,195 people on board along with war material, 6 million rounds of ammunition, and over 1,200 cases of shrapnel shells. This was a direct violation of international neutrality treaties. Germany protested to the Wilson administration with no results. Finally, Germany took out 50 ads in American newspapers 1 week before the Lusitania was to set sail. The Lusitania set sail on May 1st, 1915 from New York City. She was to rendezvous with the Juno destroyer off the coast of Ireland for protection. They never met, as the Juno was called off duty and ordered to report to Queenstown at the last minute. Along with the fact that the Lusitania was ordered to slow down to preserve the use of coal, and they quickly became sitting ducks. The Germans blew a hole in the side of the Lusitania and exploded the munitions that they were transporting. One of the largest ships ever built sank in 8 minutes. The head of the official investigation into the Lusitania quit his job, citing that, quote, the Lusitania case was damn dirty business, unquote. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan sent a note to the German government asking to, quote, come to a clear and full understanding as to the grave situation which has resulted, unquote, from the sinking of the Lusitania. When the German government responded by justifying their Navy's action on the basis that the Lusitania was carrying munitions and that they were warned, Woodrow Wilson himself penned a strongly worded note insisting that the sinking had been an illegal action and demanding that Germany cease unrestricted submarine warfare against unarmed merchantmen. On May 9, 1915, Secretary of State Bryan sent a note to President Wilson. It said, quote, Germany has the right to prevent contraband going to the Allies, and a ship carrying contraband should not rely upon passengers to protect her from attack. It would be like putting women and children in front of an army, unquote. When Wilson wrote a stronger statement to Germany, Bryan tendered his resignation on June 9, 1915, as he became disillusioned with the war drums being beaten by the administration. He was asked to reconsider his resignation and promised to think about it overnight. His wife described that night as a restless night for the Secretary of State. He finally did some reading until he became drowsy. He read a book called A Wreath of Appreciation of Andrew Jackson. In it, the Secretary saw the connection of the bankers and the pending World War. He resigned the next day, hoping that so close to the election, his stand might prevent the government from moving towards war. Modern war is enabled by modern banking. Nothing creates debts better than war. War is necessary to the debt necessary to pay back the principal and interest of prior debts. Also, it is important to destroy capital. World War I created the most debt ever. The Rothschilds in Frankfurt lent money to Germany. The Rothschilds in London lent money to England. The Rothschilds in Vienna lent money to Austria. The Rothschilds in Paris lent money to France. All at a time when J.P. Morgan was the largest consumer on earth, spending $10 million a day. While France and Germany were locked in a bloody stalemate, Britain mobilized nearly 1 million men in the Persian Gulf against the Ottoman Empire. After the war, the Allies carved up the Ottoman Empire, with the British getting the crown jewel of what is today known as Iraq. They practically gave away Saudi Arabia, which of course was a huge blunder, but they got what they wanted. Germany and her access to the largest oil reserves in the world were now in shambles. So what would have happened if we had stayed out of World War I? The United States would have watched two old world powers end up bloody and bankrupt. There would have been no communist coup in the Soviet Union, and that would have prevented Stalin's genocide and gulags. There would have been no rise of Hitler or the Nazis. There would have been no World War II and war crime firebombing of Dresden, Germany, or the nuclear hellfire of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. No Cold War, no CIA, coups or assassinations, no Vietnam, no Cuban Missile Crisis, no Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, no CIA funding of Al-Qaeda, no radicalization of Islam, no American and British coup in Iran, no Iran-Iraq war, no 9/11, no Gulf War I, II, or now III, no police state, and ultimately no collapse of the dollar. Our ignorance of history and our conscious or unconscious support of the debt and death paradigm gives rise to the worst in humanity that would spread debt and death globally and generationally. How many people sell their souls every day to do their part to fund this travesty? How long can we turn a blind eye to the violent psychopaths that we empower? How many children will we kill or enslave with debt? Nature has a way to sort these things out, and a day is coming for judgment. We will reap what we have sowed. Don't think because you did nothing that you will not be affected. Everyone, guilty or innocent, will feel the flame that will burn everything down to the ground. Your only job is to extricate yourself as best as you can from the debt and death paradigm and seek to build a better world on the other side. We believe silver will be crucial as a transitional metal to bring real capital to the next financial paradigm. Learn more at silvershieldcollection.com. The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. The growth of financial capitalism made possible a centralization of world economic control and use of this power for the direct benefit of financiers and the indirect injury of all other economic groups. Professor Carol Quigley of Georgetown University. The first half of the rise and the fall of the Banksters series has chronicled the consolidation of the banking industry by banking dynasties like the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, Morgan, Warburg, Schiff, Aldrich, and more. These cunning men now own and control the world's privately held central banks that dominate governments, industries, and humanity as a whole.
Since the Federal Reserve has come into being in 1913, illegally, without a constitutional amendment, by bribing a few senators during Christmas vacation, they turned over the most important power that the American government has, the creation and issuance of money, to a private bank. Through that private bank issuing money, they have destroyed this country. They have destroyed the purchasing power of the money in this country. They've created social programs that are destroying this country.
With the establishment of the privately owned Federal Reserve in 1913, these power-hungry men then set about to spread debt and death throughout the rest of the world through the industrialization and financialization of war. They spread death to all those that opposed them and death to all of those that fell under their spell. For over 100 years, this consolidation of power has brought humanity closer to their ultimate goal of a new world order or a one-world government where the Anglo-American criminal elite rule.
When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order.
There's a need for a new world order.
Never before has a new world order had to be assembled from so many different perceptions.
Bush kept said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order.
It is a big idea, a new world order.
We kept talking about a new world order.
We need a system of enforceable world law, a democratic federal world government.
For decades you've told us the way it is, but tonight we honor you for fighting for the way it could be.
Create a new world order.
As an incredible window of opportunity to lead in shaping a new world order.
It is a new world order.
And the hope that each of us has to build a new world order.
To use this disaster to carry out what his father, a phrase his father used, I think, only once, and hasn't been used since, and that is a new world order.
Into the creation of a new world order, financial world order.
In this new century, Americans and Europeans alike will be required to do more, not less. Partnership and cooperation among nations is not a choice.
Today, Europe can propose the principles and rules that will shape a new global order.
Good evening, everybody. President Obama and British Prime Minister Gordon today calling for a new world order to tackle our global economic crisis.
Look, there is the possibility in the next few months of a global New Deal that will involve all the countries of the world in sorting out and cleaning up the banking system.
What it really is putting the American economy under international regulation. And those people who have been yelling, oh, the UN's going to take over global
conspiracy theorists.
They've been crazy, but now they're right.
We've got to give them a stake in creating the kind of world order that I think all of us would like to see.
So the ultimate goal that these people have in mind is the goal to create a one-world government run by the banking industry.
These arrogant psychopaths sought to dominate nature and ultimately their fellow man. While these men are very powerful, we will see that they are not all powerful. Now we will start to show the cracks in their plans with too big to fail. Like a cancer that metastasizes in a healthy host, the productive organs will start to shut down. Soon the cancer will spread and eventually kill the host. There is no cure to the bankster cancer other than a total collapse of their system. They have not only infected our financial system, but our politics, relationships, values, and even our consciousness. Only a complete systemic collapse will end this scourge upon humanity.
We are an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you'll study that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how these things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be just left to study what we do. Karl Rove.
Throughout the 20th century, the Anglo-American criminal elite sought to destroy their rivals and spread debt to everyone else. With the power of secrecy, these scheming men would use the age-old formula of creating problems, waiting for the inevitable public reaction, and then pushing forward their predetermined solution. Once the Federal Reserve was established, these cunning men set about to foment war with a growing economic and military rival in Germany, with a race towards oil in the Middle East. The, quote, war to end all wars, unquote, claimed 16 million lives and 20 million wounded. This was just a warm-up for what the bankers wanted next. The first truly international central bank ever created was called the Bank of International Settlements. It was originally created to facilitate reparations imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. This was just a perfect excuse to start an international banking system that was above the law of any one nation. With the expanded power of the international banking system in place, the Anglo-American banksters then sought to create chaos out of order.
You see, the real value of a conflict, the true value, is in the debt that it creates. You control the debt, you control everything.
Literally every single major revolution, war, and economic crash has the fingerprints of these men as they sought to spread debt and death throughout the world. In the epic Sons of Liberty Academy, we document how they were behind the communist revolution in Russia, the rise of Hitler, stole America's gold, caused the Great Depression, brought fascism to Italy, created the military-industrial complex, funded both sides of the Cold War, bled America and Vietnam, funded socialism and the breakup of the family in America with the Great Society, caused the oil shocks in the 1970s, funded the international drug trade, all of that on top of the countless false flags, coups, and assassinations. From the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913, global debt was only a few $billion. Now, we are measuring it in hundreds of trillions to quadrillions. All the while, the cunning men are taking their cut and laughing all the way to the bank. And this does not factor in the hundreds of millions of lives that were unnecessarily lost due to war, disease, or depression that these cunning men have wrought on humanity. While the progress of the international criminal bankers looks like an invincible juggernaut, this trail of debt and death is more out of desperation than divine strength. When you have to force something on the world with the threat of death, it is unnatural and therefore not real, and they fear this. Beyond all of the fortunes, conspiracies, and genocides, the criminal elite are trying to hide their fatal flaw of their scheme, debt-based money. Their entire scheme of governments, media, militaries, corporations, think tanks, oil wars, drug running, and just about every other evil scheme in the world is utterly reliant upon the original sin of fractional reserve banking. Throughout most of humanity, men have used gold and silver as money. They were durable, divisible, portable, and intrinsic value served humanity well and limited these scheming psychopathic men from engaging in unprofitable efforts of collectivism like war and welfare. With the establishment of a fractional reserve banking system at the Federal Reserve, the very nature of money was transformed from intrinsic value to debt. Power was shifted from those that provided value to humanity to those that enslaved humanity with debt and death. No longer did harvesting the world's resources or adding value to them create wealth. Now, those that created the most debt created the most wealth, and these men knew that nothing creates more debt than war. Under this fractional reserve system, when debt is created, money is created. When debt is paid off, money is destroyed. When you truly grasp the enormity of that little idea, your world will never be the same again. When you take on any debt, you are literally creating money out of thin air, and you are the collateral. They use your debt obligation to back the money they create. This is why the debt will never be paid off, for if it did, there would literally be no money left in the world. If you really think about this, it is even worse than that. If your debts create all of the money in the world, where then does the money come from to pay the debt back with interest? Your debt only creates the principal amount that then enters the economy, not the interest. The only way for the interest on the loan to be paid is that every year more debt has to be created in the excess of debt and interest accrued the year before. This is why the global debt creation is growing exponentially. It has to, or we would see a massive collapse. For if all the debt was paid off, there would not only be no money in existence, but the bankers would still say we owe the interest on all of the money, even though there's no money left.
The whole government is a Ponzi scheme.
It is insane that we have based all of human life off this sick system. What's even worse is the way that humanity is so completely ignorant of the way the world has gone so horribly wrong. This simple little fact of economics explains why we have a constant state of war, huge and growing wealth disparity, destruction of local communities, millions on antidepressants, systemic unemployment, the breakup of the family, riots, and even suicides like Robin Williams. Debt money is the rot behind all of it. Most men live lives of quiet desperation and go to their grave with their song still in them. Henry David Thoreau. Humanity is suffering under a monetary system that is rigged to keep us in a constant, unnatural, quiet panic. This is done to keep us so worried about the day-to-day struggle of our lives so that we never have the time to contemplate, much less change our way of life. The wealthy know this very well, and even recently, a billionaire hedge fund manager, Tom Steyer, was quoted as saying that Americans were not as sophisticated as the ultra-wealthy because, quote, everybody else, which is the 99.5% of the people whose lives are very busy and complicated and pressing, and they don't have a lot of time to think about the things that don't immediately impact themselves and their family, unquote. Well, Tom, if we did not have a rigged game that you and your crony capitalist buddies were not constantly stealing from us with bailouts, wars, and insider training, humanity would blossom. But we do have these cancerous parasites that produce nothing of any tangible value, and then have the nerve to talk down to the good people who are doing the best with what they have. If Tom Steyer was half the man he claims he is, he would tell the truth about the system that made him so wealthy and promote individual solutions to shield those individuals from the banking system's inevitable collapse. Most people that suffer under this system are in denial and think that this is just the way it is. Many in the anger phase protest against the cops or puppet bankers and politicians. Or worse, in the bargaining phase, they support collectivist messiahs that vow to fix the collectivist problems. Hope and fear of this system are a purposeful waste of time, which then leads people to the depression phase of the awakening.
God almighty.
The final phase of acceptance realizes that while the world is messed up, the solution is only in our hands and nowhere else. Without control of the money supply, every other sinister scheme simply would not exist. Their ability to create debt and therefore money out of thin air has empowered the worst in humanity. The solution is for individuals to stack real tangible wealth outside of this rigged casino. The fatal flaw of the need to constantly expand debt was the driving force of the American empire as it dominated the world after the end of the Cold War. This went unchallenged as America's largest generation, the baby boomers, entered into their peak earning years, and they were the first generation to embrace debt. They rocked through the rest of the 90s consuming, going into debt, and throwing money at Wall Street. Then, The party crashed with the collapse of the tech bubble in the year 2000 and the Enron scandal. Suddenly, there was a leak in the American empire's dam and something had to be done.
Somebody help me.
In the Sons of Liberty Academy, we covered the neocon project for a new American century, the Taliban ending the Anglo-American opium trade, Saddam selling oil for euros, the plan to dominate the grand chessboard of the world's energy resources, the building of the Homeland Police State, the $2.4 trillion missing from the Pentagon, and the false flag known as 9/11. There you will see that nothing that happens in this world happens accidentally.
I got a call one day from an attorney woman I knew, and she said, would you like to meet one of the Rockefellers? I said, sure, I'd love to. And we became friends, and he began to divulge a lot of things to me. So he said to me one night, he said that there's going to be an event there, and out of that event, you're going to see, we're going to go into Afghanistan, so we can run pipelines from the Caspian Sea. We're going to go into Iraq to take the oil and establish a base in the Middle East, and we're going to go into Venezuela and try and get rid of Chavez. And the first two they've accomplished. Chavez they didn't accomplish. And he said you're going to see guys going into caves looking for looking for people that they're never going to find. You know, he was laughing about the fact that you have this war on terror. There's no real enemy. He's talking about how by having this war on terror, you can never win it because it's an eternal war, and so you can always keep taking people's liberties away.
The American empire rolled over the rest of the world with lies about weapons of mass destruction and boogeymen in caves. The very profitable war machine was spun up, and once again the worst in humanity partied on. Behind the scenes, the bankers knew that if the debt did not grow fast enough, they needed to drive down rates to prevent the system from becoming insolvent. This market manipulation took money created out of nowhere to buy bonds to drive down rates. We were now a market totally devoid of reality, just a market of constant intervention and rigging. This fueled a housing boom and a massive misallocation in capital to rampant consumerism. We did not build anything of value to improve the lives of humanity, no productive factories to provide jobs, no new technologies that saved resources and capital. No, we blew it on McMansions, Hummers, and iPhones. No other generation in the history of the world was able to consume so much and provide so little in return. All of this was once again fueled by the minions on Wall Street that not only drove down rates but made sure that anyone that was breathing could take on more debt and buy a house and all of the things to fill the American dream. We personally saw people who could not qualify for a used car a few years prior, now all of a sudden buying $500,000 houses and Mercedes. This could not happen if not for the minions on Wall Street selling all of this garbage debt all over the world. They would package up these garbage loans and create tranches that would polish the poo into securitized gold. Just like the world just laid down for the fake war on terror, they once again trusted America. Countries, institutions, and investors all over the world ended up as unwitting owners of this garbage debt of unemployed McMansion consumers. In the financial collapse of 2008, the world woke up. They woke up to see that they were married to a cancerous psychopath and needed a plan to get divorced. They connected the dots between America's dollar dominance and the global wars that they used to secure the world's resources and trading lanes. While Goldman Sachs targeted the rising economies of Brazil, Russia, India, and China as the next targets of Wall Street dominance, we were the first to recognize these nations as the anti-hegemon. We clearly saw that these nations had all suffered under the Anglo-American Empire, and despite having no cultural or ideological unity, they did stand in opposition to the Anglo-American Empire. 5 years later, it is now very clear that the anti-hegemon will stand in political, financial, and military opposition to the Anglo-American Empire and the lies, debts, and death they have spread over the last century. Americans too woke up and saw that when times were good, Wall Street rolled in the profits, and when times were bad, they threatened to take down everyone.
And a few members were even told that there would be martial law in America if we voted no.
In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis for the average American, the world became very real. Nearly 3 decades of the American consumer dream suddenly changed. People lost money, foreclosed homes, lost their jobs, and became worse, disillusioned. As bad as the 2008 collapse was, the full-on terrible reality did not hit just then. People still had jobs, houses, and savings to lose. People had faith in the hope and the change of politicians and the omnipotence of the central bankers. As we will see in the final part of the Rise and the Fall of the Banksters series, the terminal phase is going to be brutal for everyone. There is no safety net, there is no more faith in the system, and the world will not be so gullible as it was in 2008.
Thank you again.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that was the last question. Thank you very much for coming.
We believe that physical silver outside of this inevitable systemic collapse will save the individual from the collective hell that is coming. The Silver Shield series seeks to create historically significant designs that will create generational wealth to help establish abundant solutions in the next monetary paradigm. Please visit silvershieldcollection.com.
On Thursday at about 11 o'clock in the morning, the Federal Reserve noticed a tremendous drawdown of money market accounts in the United States to the tune of $550 billion was being drawn out in a matter of an hour or two. The Treasury opened up its window to help. They pumped $105 billion in the system and quickly realized that they could not stem the tide. We were having an electronic run on the banks. They decided to close the operation, close down the money accounts, and announce a guarantee of $250,000 per account so there wouldn't be further panic out there. And that's what actually happened. If they had not done that, their estimation was that by 2 o'clock that afternoon, $5.5 trillion would have been drawn out of the money market system of the United States, would have collapsed the entire economy of the United States, and within 24 hours the world economy would have collapsed. Now, we talked at that time about what would happen if that happened. It would have been the end of our economic system and our political system as we know it.
Many of us were told in private conversations that if we voted against this bill on Monday, that the sky would fall, the market would drop 2,000 or 3,000 points the first day, another couple thousand the second day, and a few members were even told that there would be martial law in America if we voted no.
When it failed, Lehman had $639 billion in assets. Today, J.P. Morgan has nearly $2.5 trillion in assets. That's 4 times as big as Lehman was when it failed. And I guess the question I'm asking is, have they ever gotten to a plan that you can say with a straight face is credible?
Well, I've understood this to be a process. These are extremely complex documents for these firms to produce. Our second round of submissions, we're looking at plans that run into tens of thousands of pages. And I think what was intended is that this determination you're talking about whether or not they're credible, question is, do they facilitate an orderly resolution? And I think we need to give these firms feedback.
So I'll stop there because we're running out of time, but you said that these plans run to the tens of thousands of pages. All I can say is that what's been released to the public is 35 pages long.